Welcome to the monthly edition of the Tidbits in Time Almanac. For each individual day, you can look in the show notes below for a link to additional information about that day's tidbit.
March 1st, 1862. Edward George Kingsford was born in Woodstock, Ontario, Canada. He was a real estate agent, and his wife was a cousin of automaker Henry Ford. The Ford Motor Company sold 1 million units of the Model T in 1919. Ford needed wood for the dashboard, steering wheels, and other parts of the car. Lots of wood. Kingsford assisted Ford in buying a large timberland area in Michigan, helped build a sawmill there, and began supplying wood for the cars. There was a lot of scrap and sawdust. Chemist Orrin Stafford invented a method for making pillow-shaped lumps of fuel from wood waste that came to be called charcoal briquettes. After World War II, backyard outdoor grills became popular. March 2nd, 1864. Ulysses S. Grant was named Lieutenant General of Union Armies during the war between the states. 2 days later, Grant was promoted again to General-in-Chief of the armies of the northern states and was given complete control over the Union war effort. He promoted General William T. Sherman to his old job, commander of the Federal armies in the Western Theater. Grant then commanded Sherman to march against the Confederate Army of Tennessee and to continue forward until he reached Atlanta, burning everything in his path. At the same time, Grant reorganized the Army of the Potomac until it was a potent fighting force, and then he sent it into battle against the Robert E. Lee Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond. Both forces were to move forward until they met each other, pinching the Confederate forces, and then they would join together to form a massive fighting force poised to destroy the Confederacy, which is exactly what would happen the following year. Grant and his subordinate Sherman were severely criticized for their policy of devastation against civilians. March 3rd, 1959. Ira Jeffrey Glass was born in Baltimore, Maryland. His father was a CPA doing tax returns, a noble profession. His mother was a clinical psychologist. Beginning as an intern at the age of 19, Ira Glass has been employed by National Public Radio now for more than 3 decades, becoming famous for his show, This American Life. The show has a huge following, heard on more than 500 radio stations, with an estimated 2 million live listeners and more than 2.3 million on the podcast. Ira Glass has a remarkable talent for combining journalism with storytelling. March 4th, 1933. John Nance Garner left his position as Speaker of the House of Representatives to become the Vice President of the United States. Garner was born in a log cabin near Detroit, Texas. His nickname was Cactus Jack, and he became a lawyer in 1890, then later a county judge, then later a state senator. Due to hanging on through the seniority system, he became Speaker in 1931. Then chosen as the running mate to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Garner served as Vice President. Though Garner was successful in getting much legislation through Congress, he became disillusioned with FDR's New Deal. In particular, he opposed Roosevelt's Supreme Court packing scheme and butted heads over later legislation the president wanted. March 5th, 1853. The Steinway & Sons Piano Company was founded in New York City by Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg. An immigrant and piano builder in his native small town of Zeesen, Germany, he was a master craftsman. Therefore, his pianos were, and still are, expensive. Accordingly, 2 of their models retail for more than $2.5 million. The next model down is much more affordable, at only $1.2 million. And their cheapest model is a paltry $200,000. March 6, 1745. Count Pulaski was born in Warsaw, Poland. As a young man, he rose in the ranks through the Polish cavalry in the Bar Confederation, fighting for independence against Russia, Prussia, and Austria. He was recruited by Benjamin Franklin and the Marquis de Lafayette to cross the ocean and join the colonists in the American War for Independence. After saving the life of George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine, he formed the Pulaski Cavalry Legion, which was important to the war effort. He is one of the most controversial people in American history. March 7, 1850. Senator Daniel Webster gave the most important of the many speeches in the U.S. Senate in favor of the Compromise of 1850. He, along with Senator Henry Clay, was responsible for the delay of the war between the states by about a decade. Some argue the delay helped, and others that the delay hurt. One of the greatest American speechmakers and lawyers ever, he is memorialized in the famous Stephen Binet short story entitled The Devil and Daniel Webster. March 8, 1948. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision in McCullom v. Board of Education. The Champaign, Illinois School Board allowed a voluntary half-hour weekly for religious instruction class, and the court held that that class was unconstitutional, despite there being a similar voluntary class in more than 2,000 other school districts in the nation, affecting more than 1.5 million school children. This case tested the principle of released time for school children. The court voted 8-1, and the dissenting judge said that an incidental interruption of the school day did not rise to the level of requiring court action. This was one of the earliest church versus state cases, which have been followed by many more, which have limited further the free exercise of religion clause and an overly broad emphasis on the Establishment Clause. March 9, 1943. Robert James Bobby Fischer was born in Chicago, Illinois. He was perhaps the greatest chess player of all time and became famous for upsetting the Russian grandmasters during the Cold War. The strategies in his games are legendary. Fischer ran afoul of U.S. government embargoes of various countries by traveling to chess tournaments worldwide without permission. March 10, 2014. Former U.S. Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul introduced his all-digital curriculum. Now children can get from kindergarten through high school almost cost-free to society and their parents. Khan Academy has already been in the marketplace for a while. There will be others. What impact will this eventually have on government schools, teacher unions, brick buildings, and property taxes? I don't know Ron Paul personally, but one of my best friends was Gary Kilgore North, Ph.D., who designed all the curriculum and wrote most of it. Sadly, Dr. North died recently, on February 24, 2022, at age 80. He was a prolific author, writing more than 100 books, big 2 or 3 inches, and he blogged 4 lengthy essays every single day. He was one of the top 3 smartest people I have ever known, so I tried to read everything he wrote, but it was hard to keep up. I will greatly miss him, as will many other people. A lengthy eulogy to him is on his website at garynorth.com. March 11, 1936. Antonin Gregory Scalia was born in Trenton, New Jersey. An extremely good student, he finished high in his class, usually first, in all the schools he ever attended. Appointed by President Ronald Reagan to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1986, Scalia served for almost 30 years until his death. Despite having to face hostile Democrats at his confirmation hearing, he displayed so much legal brilliance that he was confirmed 98-0. One of his 9 children, Paul Scalia, gave a great homily at his funeral. March 12, 1710. Every year, the Promenade concerts are held at the Royal Albert Hall in London, England, culminating in the last night of the promenades, a patriotic, some would say jingoistic, flag-waving musical jamboree where the audience joins in lustily with perennial favorites such as Rule Britannia. The composer, Thomas Arne, who was born on this day, is responsible for setting the widely misunderstood Rule Britannia to music from words by the poet James Thomson. Thomson wrote the poem at a time in the 18th century when Britain did not rule the waves, whereas the Dutch, France, and Spain possessed formidable fleets. But he foresaw that by sticking to their guns, so to speak, the British could emerge as the world's #1 naval power. Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves, he pleaded. Promenade concerts were originally held in London pleasure gardens and were so called because the audience would stroll around as the musicians played. March 13, 2022. Daylight saving time. Warning, warning. We have been saddled with this since 1966, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Uniform Time Act into law. The act allowed for states to opt out, and some did. In modern times, there are proposed bills in many state legislatures that would modify or abolish the outdated practice. To check your state, simply click the link below in the description. In the U.S. Senate, for example, there's one bill that was proposed about this time last year, but it's bottled up in committee. Do you think President Joe Biden would sign such a bill if it ever reaches his desk? March 14, 1948. Theodorus Gerardus Joseph Theo Jansen was born in Scheveningen, Netherlands. He is the inventor of strandbeesten, which means beach animals in Dutch. These are a type of moving kinetic structures that vaguely resemble walking animals. All his models are based on a system of triangles and connecting links which convert the rotation of an axle into a stepping motion. They are primarily driven by breezes and are constructed from PVC pipes, wood, fabric airfoils, and zip ties. And they are quite amazing. March 15, 1932. Alan Laverne Bean was born in Wheeler, Texas. He grew up in Minden, Louisiana, where his father worked for the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. Bean was a Navy carrier jet pilot, later becoming a Navy test pilot. When he was accepted by NASA as an astronaut, he had 4,890 hours as a jet pilot. He was selected for Apollo 12 and thus became the 4th person to ever walk on the moon. He later commanded Skylab 3, spending another 59 days in space. March 16, 1850. The Scarlet Letter was published by its author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. It was not a very good book, and the author did not expect it to sell well, but 2,500 copies were printed, and they sold out within 10 days. Hawthorne was living at a time when there was almost no such thing as American literature, in part because the American publishing industry was so behind the times. In order to publish a book, a single printer would edit the manuscript, set the type, operate the printing press, bind the pages into books, and then sell them. It was remarkably inefficient, and so it was almost impossible to produce a bestseller since so few copies were available to be sold. But by 1850, books had just begun being printed by machines. The Scarlet Letter would come to be called the first great American novel, partly because it was the first that could reach a large audience. March 17, 2022. St. Patrick's Day celebrates the Roman Catholic saint who illustrated the Trinity using the shamrock. Many Irish immigrants settled on the east coast of the U.S., which, ironically, is a bastion of the Unitarian heresy, that is, not believing in the triune nature of God, one of the most important doctrinal disputes to ever arise in Christendom. Was Jesus just a man, albeit an unusually good one? Or was he the bodily embodiment of the Godhead? And what about the Holy Spirit? March 18, 1927. George Ames Plimpton was born in New York City. A sports journalist, he got professional athletes to let him compete against them. Then he wrote articles about the experience for Sports Illustrated magazine. Plimpton was demolished in a tennis match against Pancho Gonzalez and vanquished in golf by Arnold Palmer. He played in exhibition football games with the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Colts. He was a hockey goalie for the Boston Bruins in a preseason game. He pitched for the American League prior to a postseason game against the National League. He sparred against boxers Sugar Ray Leonard and Archie Moore. As a kid, I loved reading those articles. March 19, 1922. Hiru Onoda was born in Kamakawa, Wakayama, Japan. As a soldier, he spent almost 30 years holding out in a remote part of the Philippine Islands under the mistaken belief that World War II had not yet ended. Even in spite of finding leaflets and newspapers indicating that the war was over, he disregarded them because he thought they were a trick. Afterward, he was hailed in Japan as a hero, and he died at the age of 91 after living for a long life. March 20th, 2006. Baron William Trump was born in New York City. At only age 16, he is already 6 foot 7 inches and towers over his father, Donald Trump, who is only 6'3". Baron's mother, Melania Trump, is 5 feet 11 inches tall. So when Baron finally stops growing, he's going to be a very tall boy. March 21st, 1152. The marriage of Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, and King Louis VII of France was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. But the end of the marriage was really because she had not yet produced a male heir. It was the most expensive divorce in history because Eleanor was the richest landowner of her day. She was also wild, fun-loving, and beautiful. In quick order, she remarried Henry Plantagenet, who was soon to become King Henry I of England, and Eleanor became queen. She gave birth to 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters. One of her sons became King Richard the Lionheart. March 22, 1638. Anne Marbury Hutchinson, her husband, and her family were expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She and her family then resettled in Rhode Island, and later the Bronx, before all but one of them were massacred by a Native American tribe. The expulsion from the Massachusetts Bay Colony was due to her dispute with Puritan church leaders on the discrepancy between salvation by works versus salvation by grace. She was a particular target because she gathered a group of women in her home for regular Bible studies. Among her descendants are Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, not to mention presidential candidates Stephen A. Douglas, George W. Romney, and Mitt Romney, plus Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and various other noteworthy people. March 23, 1893. The Fort Worth stockyards were incorporated. The railroad opened in 1876, and ranchers built pens to hold cattle that could be slaughtered, packed, and shipped for sale in the rest of the country. Armour and Swift built meatpacking plants. Nowadays, the stockyards are host to the only twice-daily Longhorn cattle drive held anywhere in the world. March 24th, 2022, National Chocolate-Covered Raisins Day. Chocolate comes from cocoa beans, and beans are vegetables. Raisins come from grapes, and grapes are fruit. Therefore, one could argue that this is a good way to get your fruit and vegetable needs met. March 25th, 1937. Thomas Stephen Monahan was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He and his brother James co-founded Domino's Pizza in 1960. Tom later traded his Volkswagen Beetle to James for full ownership of the company. His innovations include a box design that allowed more boxes to be carried without crushing, and a marketing program based on fast delivery in a half hour or less. March 26, 1931. Leonard Simon Nimoy was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Jewish immigrants from Iziaslav, Ukraine, his father walked over the border into Poland, while his mother and grandmother were smuggled out in a horse-drawn wagon, hiding under bales of hay. While trying to break into acting, Leonard Nimoy worked in an ice cream parlor and drove a cab in Los Angeles. From 1959 to 1962, television audiences saw him on 4 episodes of Wagon Train, but he is best known as Spock, the half-Vulcan science officer on Star Trek, the original series. A real-life asteroid was named 4864 Nimoy in his honor. March 27, 1971. Nathan Fillion was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. An actor, he is best known for his roles as Captain Mal Reynolds on the space cowboy television series Firefly, and as best-selling author Richard Castle in the TV series Castle. Fillion is currently starring as policeman John Nolan on TV's The Rookie. March 28, 1836. Johann Gottlieb Friedrich Pabst was born in the province of Saxony of the Kingdom of Prussia. Pabst emigrated with his parents, became a Lake Michigan steamship captain, and married into a Milwaukee brewing family. He won the prize at the Chicago World's Fair for his beer and promptly changed its name to Pabst Blue Ribbon. Known by some derisively as a bowling alley beer, the character played by Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino, and the character played by Ray McKinnon in The Accountant, drink a lot of PBR. March 29, 1974. The Terracotta Army was found by people digging a well in Shanxi Province, China. Thought to have been fashioned during the reign of Xian Shi Huang, who died in the year 210 BC, a startling number of statues were buried under an almost 22-square-mile site. It is thought that the army was assembled to guard the tomb of their leader. March 30th, 2010. Serial entrepreneur Gary Hoover put the final touches on the presentation he was giving the next day, ringing the registers. I found absolutely fascinating his approximately 2-hour explanation of how retailers from the late 1800s through today have reached consumers. March 31st, 1943. Owen John Baggett was flying a B-24 mission when his squadron was intercepted by Japanese Zeros. His plane was so severely damaged that he and his crew were forced to bail out. A Japanese pilot circled and began shooting at the men floating under their parachutes. Baggett played dead, but apparently not convinced that Baggett was really dead. A Zero pulled up to him at near stall speed, the pilot opening his canopy to check. Baggett drew his M1911 Colt handgun and fired 4 shots, then watched as the Japanese plane fell to the ground. Thus, Baggett is the only person in World War II to take out a plane with nothing but a pistol in aerial combat.
That's all for now. I look forward to hanging out with you next month. To get Tidbits emailed to you for free, please visit tidbitsintime.com.